In the Supreme Court, a judge began to berate the woman before him without knowing who she was. But when he saw her constitutional badge, not only her foundations, but the entire justice system were shaken. The marble corridors of the Robert H. Jackson Federal Building echoed with the measured footsteps of attorneys, clerks, and court personnel as they prepared for another day in the pursuit of justice. The building, which housed the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, stood as a monument to the American legal system, its neoclassical architecture embodying the gravitas and permanence that the law was meant to represent. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, the building buzzed with more activity than usual. A highly anticipated constitutional law case was scheduled for oral arguments, drawing attorneys from prestigious law firms, constitutional scholars, and legal observers from across the country. The case, involving fundamental questions about the separation of powers and executive authority, had captured the attention of the legal community and promised to have far-reaching implications for American jurisprudence. Justice Elena Vasquez arrived at the building at precisely 8:30 a.m., as was her custom when sitting by designation on lower court cases. At 51, Justice Vasquez was one of the youngest members of the United States Supreme Court, having been appointed to the nation's highest judicial office just 3 years earlier, after a distinguished career that included service as a federal appellate judge, a constitutional law professor at Yale Law School, and a Supreme Court clerk to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Vasquez's path to the Supreme Court had been marked by intellectual brilliance, unwavering commitment to the rule of law, and a deep understanding of how constitutional principles applied to the complex realities of modern American life. Her judicial opinions were widely respected for their clarity, legal reasoning, and careful attention to precedent, while her academic writings on constitutional interpretation had become essential reading in law schools across the country. This morning, Justice Vasquez had chosen to dress in a way that reflected both the solemnity of her judicial role and her personal heritage. She wore a beautifully tailored charcoal gray suit with a silk blouse in deep navy blue, paired with modest jewelry that included a small American flag pin and pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon that emphasized the intelligent lines of her face and the confident bearing that had served her well throughout her legal career. Justice Vasquez carried with her a leather briefcase containing her case files, legal precedents, and handwritten notes for the day's proceedings. As a Supreme Court justice sitting by designation on the appellate court, she brought not only her individual expertise, but also the institutional authority of the nation's highest court to the proceedings. Her presence elevated the significance of the case and ensured that the legal arguments would be subjected to the most rigorous constitutional analysis. As Justice Vasquez made her way through the building's security checkpoint and toward the judicial chambers, she was reviewing her notes on the constitutional issues that would be argued that morning. The case involved complex questions about the limits of executive power during times of national emergency, and she wanted to ensure that her questions during oral argument would illuminate the most important legal and constitutional principles at stake. The Honorable Judge Robert Caldwell was already in his chambers when Justice Vasquez arrived at the appellate court section of the building. Judge Caldwell, at 58, was a veteran of the federal judiciary with over 15 years of experience on the appellate bench. He had been appointed during a previous administration and had developed a reputation as a competent but somewhat rigid jurist who valued traditional approaches to legal interpretation and had little patience for what he considered to be innovative or progressive legal theories. Judge Caldwell's background reflected the traditional path to federal judicial appointment. He had attended a prestigious law school, worked at a large corporate law firm for over a decade, served briefly in the Department of Justice, and then been appointed first to the Federal District Court and later elevated to the appellate level. His judicial philosophy emphasized textual interpretation of statutes and a narrow reading of constitutional provisions, particularly those involving individual rights and federal regulatory authority. This morning, Judge Caldwell was reviewing his own case files when his law clerk informed him that a Supreme Court justice would be sitting by designation on the three-judge panel for the day's constitutional case. Judge Caldwell nodded approvingly, thinking that the participation of a Supreme Court justice would add prestige to the proceedings and might provide useful guidance on how the nation's highest court might ultimately view the constitutional issues involved. What Judge Caldwell did not know was the identity of the Supreme Court justice who would be joining the panel, nor did he fully appreciate the significance of Justice Vasquez's groundbreaking legal scholarship and her reputation as one of the court's most intellectually formidable members. At approximately 9:15 a.m., Justice Vasquez made her way to the judges' conference room, adjacent to the main courtroom where the three-judge panel would meet briefly before the beginning of oral arguments. The conference room was elegantly appointed with dark wood paneling, leather-bound legal volumes, and portraits of distinguished federal judges who had served with honor throughout the court's history. Judge Caldwell was already seated at the polished mahogany conference table when Justice Vasquez entered the room. He looked up from his case files and saw a woman who appeared younger than he had expected, dressed professionally, but without the obvious markers of seniority or authority that he unconsciously associated with Supreme Court justices. In his mind, Supreme Court justices should be older, preferably male, and should carry themselves with the kind of obvious gravitas that announced their elevated status within the legal hierarchy. "Excuse me," Judge Caldwell said, his tone carrying a note of polite confusion. "I think you may be in the wrong conference room. This is reserved for the judges hearing the constitutional case this morning." Justice Vasquez paused in the act of placing her briefcase on the conference table and looked at Judge Caldwell with an expression of mild surprise. "I'm Justice Elena Vasquez," she said simply. "I'm sitting by designation on today's panel." Judge Caldwell's brow furrowed as he processed this information. While he recognized the name from Supreme Court opinions and legal news, the woman standing before him didn't match his mental image of what a Supreme Court justice should look like. "Justice Vasquez?" he repeated, his tone suggesting skepticism about her claim. "That's correct," Justice Vasquez replied, maintaining her professional composure despite the obvious doubt in Judge Caldwell's voice. "I believe we're scheduled to hear oral arguments in Martinez v. United States at 10 o'clock. Judge Caldwell continued to study Justice Vasquez's face, as if trying to reconcile her appearance with his preconceived notions about Supreme Court justices. "I was expecting Justice Vasquez to be, well, different," he said finally. Justice Vasquez felt a familiar tightness in her chest that came with these moments of having her credentials questioned based on assumptions about her appearance, her age, or her background. "Different in what way, Judge Caldwell?" she asked quietly. Judge Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, realizing that his comment had revealed more about his own assumptions than he had intended. You seem quite young for a Supreme Court justice," he said, attempting to recover from his initial skepticism. "I'm 51 years old," Justice Vasquez replied evenly. "I was appointed to the Supreme Court 3 years ago, after serving on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals for 8 years. Judge Caldwell nodded slowly, but his expression suggested that he remained unconvinced. "And you're here alone?" "Supreme Court justices usually travel with staff members, security personnel, that sort of thing." Justice Vasquez recognized the subtext of Judge Caldwell's questions. He was essentially asking her to prove that she was who she claimed to be, despite her having provided her name and position. The implication that a real Supreme Court justice would travel with an entourage revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of how Supreme Court justices actually conducted their business when sitting by designation on lower courts. "Judge Caldwell," Justice Vasquez said, her voice remaining calm but carrying a subtle edge of authority. "When Supreme Court justices sit by designation, they typically work directly with the local court staff. There's no need for additional personnel." Judge Caldwell's skepticism appeared to deepen rather than diminish. "I'm going to need to verify your identity before we proceed," he said, his tone taking on the authoritative quality he typically used when addressing attorneys who appeared before his court. "I can't simply take your word for who you are." Justice Vasquez felt a flash of irritation at the suggestion that her word was somehow insufficient, but she maintained her judicial composure. "What sort of verification did you have in mind, Judge Caldwell?" "Well, do you have some form of official identification that proves you're a Supreme Court justice?" Judge Caldwell asked, as if the question were entirely reasonable. Justice Vasquez reached into her briefcase and withdrew her Supreme Court identification, a distinctive document that bore the seal of the United States Supreme Court and identified her as Associate Justice Elena Vasquez. She placed the identification on the conference table where Judge Caldwell could examine it. Judge Caldwell picked up the identification and studied it carefully, but his unfamiliarity with Supreme Court credentials made it difficult for him to assess its authenticity. "This could be forged," he said finally. "Anyone could have this printed up." The suggestion that she might be using forged Supreme Court credentials struck Justice Vasquez as so absurd that she almost laughed. "Judge Caldwell, do you seriously believe that someone would forge Supreme Court identification to impersonate a justice for the purpose of sitting on an appellate panel?" Judge Caldwell's face reddened slightly as he realized how his suggestion sounded, but his pride prevented him from backing down. "I've seen stranger things happen," he said defensively. "I'm simply being cautious." Justice Vasquez studied Judge Caldwell's face, noting the defensive posture and the stubborn set of his jaw. She had encountered similar attitudes before, particularly from judges who felt threatened by her youth, her gender, or her rapid rise to the Supreme Court. "Judge Caldwell, perhaps you could call the Supreme Court to verify my identity if you have concerns about my credentials." "That's exactly what I intend to do," Judge Caldwell replied, reaching for his desk phone. "I'm not going to proceed with this case until I'm satisfied that everything is legitimate." As Judge Caldwell placed his call to the Supreme Court's administrative offices, Justice Vasquez sat quietly, reflecting on the absurdity of the situation. Here she was, one of 9 people in the entire United States who held the title of Supreme Court Justice, being treated as though she were an imposter trying to infiltrate a lower court proceeding. The phone call to the Supreme Court was brief but definitive. Judge Caldwell's face grew progressively paler as the court's administrative officer confirmed not only Justice Vasquez's identity, but also expressed surprise that any federal judge would question the credentials of a sitting Supreme Court justice. Judge Caldwell slowly replaced the phone receiver and looked across the conference table at Justice Vasquez, who had remained perfectly composed throughout the verification process. "Justice Vasquez," he said quietly, I apologize for my skepticism. It's been confirmed that you are indeed who you claim to be." Justice Vasquez nodded slowly, her expression revealing neither anger nor satisfaction, but rather the kind of diplomatic professionalism that she had learned to deploy in difficult situations. "Judge Caldwell, I appreciate your apology. However, I'm curious about what led you to question my identity in the first place." Judge Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, knowing that any honest answer would reveal the unconscious biases and assumptions that had guided his thinking. "I suppose I was just surprised," he said weakly. "You're not what I expected when I was told a Supreme Court justice would be joining our panel." "What did you expect?" Justice Vasquez asked, her tone remaining neutral, but her question cutting directly to the heart of the matter. Justice Vasquez nodded slowly, her expression revealing neither anger nor satisfaction, but rather the kind of diplomatic professionalism that she had learned to deploy in difficult situations. "Judge Caldwell, I appreciate your apology. However, I'm curious about what led you to question my identity in the first place." Judge Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, knowing that any honest answer would reveal the unconscious biases and assumptions that had guided his thinking. "I suppose I was just surprised," he said weakly. "You're not what I expected when I was told a Supreme Court justice would be joining our panel." "What did you expect?" Justice Vasquez asked, her tone remaining neutral, but her question cutting directly to the heart of the matter. She stood and gathered her case files. Perhaps we should proceed to the courtroom and focus on the constitutional issues that the parties have brought before us for resolution. As they made their way to the main courtroom, Judge Caldwell realized that his assumptions about Justice Vasquez had revealed more about his own limitations than about her qualifications. The awkwardness of the situation would affect the entire day's proceedings, serving as a constant reminder of how prejudice and preconceived notions could undermine the dignity and effectiveness of the judicial process. The courtroom itself was a magnificent space that embodied the majesty and authority of the American legal system. High ceilings, marble columns, and rich wood paneling created an atmosphere of solemnity and respect, while the elevated judicial bench reinforced the constitutional principle that the law stood above the personal preferences and prejudices of individual citizens. As the three-judge panel took their seats at the bench, with Justice Vasquez positioned in the center as the senior member of the panel, the contrast between her quiet authority and Judge Caldwell's obvious discomfort was apparent to the experienced attorneys and legal observers in the courtroom. Word of the earlier confrontation had begun to spread through the legal community, and many in attendance were watching carefully to see how the dynamics between the judges would affect the proceedings. The oral arguments that followed would be marked by Justice Vasquez's incisive questioning and deep understanding of constitutional principles, demonstrating exactly why she had been appointed to the Supreme Court at such a young age. Her performance served as a stark reminder to Judge Caldwell and everyone else in the courtroom that judicial excellence was not determined by appearance, age, or conformity to traditional expectations, but by intellectual rigor, legal knowledge, and commitment to constitutional principles. During the recess between morning and afternoon sessions, Judge Caldwell approached Justice Vasquez privately to offer a more complete apology for his earlier behavior. "Justice Vasquez," he said, "I want to personally apologize for questioning your credentials this morning. My behavior was inappropriate and unprofessional." Justice Vasquez studied his face, evaluating his sincerity. "Judge Caldwell, I appreciate your apology. However, I hope you understand that this incident raises concerns about how assumptions and biases can affect the administration of justice." Judge Caldwell nodded gravely. "I do understand, and I want you to know that I'm committed to examining my own attitudes and ensuring that similar incidents don't occur in the future." "That's important," Justice Vasquez replied. "But perhaps more important is recognizing that this isn't just about individual attitudes. The legal profession has a responsibility to create an environment where all qualified individuals can serve with dignity and respect, regardless of whether they conform to traditional expectations about what judges or justices should look like." The conversation between Justice Vasquez and Judge Caldwell would continue throughout the day, evolving into a broader discussion about diversity in the judiciary, unconscious bias in legal settings, and the importance of ensuring that the courts reflected the full diversity of American society. In the weeks that followed, Judge Caldwell would use the experience as an opportunity for personal reflection and professional growth. He would seek out additional training on unconscious bias, engage with judicial diversity organizations, and become an advocate for more inclusive practices within the federal court system. Justice Vasquez, meanwhile, would continue to serve with distinction on the Supreme Court, her intellectual contributions and judicial excellence serving as a powerful reminder that merit and qualifications could not be judged by appearance or conformity to traditional expectations. The incident would ultimately serve as a case study in judicial education programs, illustrating how even experienced and well-intentioned judges could be influenced by unconscious bias, and how important it was for the legal profession to actively work to eliminate barriers to full participation by all qualified individuals. The constitutional case that had brought them together would be decided unanimously, with Justice Vasquez writing the lead opinion that would become a landmark precedent in the area of executive power and constitutional interpretation. Her opinion demonstrated the kind of legal reasoning and constitutional analysis that had made her one of the most respected members of the Supreme Court, and served as a lasting reminder that excellence in the law came from intellectual rigor and commitment to justice, not from conformity to outdated expectations about who could serve in positions of judicial authority. For Judge Caldwell, the day would remain a pivotal moment in his own judicial career, marking the beginning of a more thoughtful and inclusive approach to his service on the federal bench. His willingness to acknowledge his mistake and learn from it would ultimately make him a better judge and a more effective servant of justice. The true lesson of that day was that the strength of the American legal system lay not in its adherence to tradition for its own sake, but in its capacity to evolve and improve, ensuring that justice was administered by the most qualified individuals, regardless of their background or appearance. Justice Vasquez's presence on the Supreme Court represented not just individual achievement, but the ongoing fulfillment of the American promise that merit and dedication could overcome prejudice and preconception, creating a more perfect union where justice was truly blind to everything except the law itself. And sometimes, as Judge Caldwell learned that day, the most important legal education came not from studying precedents or constitutional texts, but from recognizing and overcoming the assumptions that could prevent the law from achieving its highest purposes of fairness, equality, and justice for all. The repercussions of that morning's incident would extend far beyond the individual embarrassment of Judge Caldwell or the personal vindication of Justice Vasquez. Within hours of the day's proceedings, word of the confrontation had spread throughout the federal judicial community, carried by law clerks, court personnel, and attorneys who had witnessed or heard about the unprecedented questioning of a Supreme Court justice's credentials. The administrative office of the U.S. courts received its first inquiry about the incident before noon, followed by a steady stream of calls from legal journalists, constitutional law professors, and judicial advocacy organizations seeking to understand how such a breach of protocol could have occurred. By evening, the story had reached the desks of editors at major legal publications and was being discussed in law school faculty lounges across the country. Chief Judge Margaret Henderson of the D.C. Circuit, a respected jurist with over 20 years of federal court experience, called an emergency meeting of the court's executive committee within 24 hours of the incident. Judge Henderson had known Justice Vasquez since her days as a circuit court judge and understood both the personal and institutional implications of what had transpired. "This is not simply a matter of one judge making an embarrassing mistake," Chief Judge Henderson told the assembled committee members. "This incident raises fundamental questions about our judicial culture and the assumptions that may be unconsciously influencing how we interact with colleagues, particularly those who may not conform to traditional expectations about judicial appearance or demographics." The committee's discussion was frank and sometimes uncomfortable, as members grappled with the reality that Judge Caldwell's behavior might reflect broader issues within the federal judiciary. Several committee members acknowledged that they had observed similar incidents, though none involving such a dramatic power differential between the individuals involved. "We need to understand that this isn't just about Judge Caldwell," said Judge Patricia Morrison, one of the few African-American women on the circuit. "This is about a system that still, in 2024, allows experienced federal judges to question the legitimacy of their colleagues based on assumptions about who looks like they belong in positions of authority." The committee ultimately voted to request a comprehensive review of judicial education and training programs, with particular attention to issues of unconscious bias, diversity, and inclusive leadership within the federal court system. The review would be conducted by a joint task force, including representatives from the Federal Judicial Center, the American Bar Association, and several judicial diversity organizations. Justice Vasquez herself became directly involved in shaping the institutional response to the incident. Rather than simply accepting apologies and moving on, she used her position and influence to advocate for systematic changes that would prevent similar situations in the future. This incident provides us with an opportunity to address issues that have been present in our judicial system for far too long, Justice Vasquez said during a private meeting with Chief Judge Henderson. We can use this moment to create positive change that will benefit not just current judges and justices, but future generations of legal professionals. Working with the Federal Judicial Center, Justice Vasquez helped develop new training modules that would be required for all federal judges within their first year of service and repeated every 5 years thereafter. The training covered unconscious bias, cultural competency, and the importance of maintaining professional respect for all colleagues regardless of their background or appearance. Judge Caldwell, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning with the consequences of his actions. While he would not face formal disciplinary action, the incident became a defining moment in his judicial career. His initial defensiveness gave way to genuine introspection as he began to understand the broader implications of his behavior. I thought I was being appropriately cautious, Judge Caldwell reflected during a subsequent interview with judicial ethics researchers. But what I was really doing was allowing my preconceived notions about what Supreme Court justices should look like to override my professional judgment and basic courtesy toward a colleague. Judge Caldwell voluntarily enrolled in additional training programs on judicial ethics and unconscious bias and began working with mentorship programs designed to support young attorneys and judges from diverse backgrounds. His transformation from the incident became a case study in how individuals could acknowledge their mistakes and use them as catalysts for positive change. The constitutional case that had brought Justice Vasquez and Judge Caldwell together would ultimately produce a landmark Supreme Court decision when it was appealed to the nation's highest court. Justice Vasquez's opinion for a unanimous court would be praised by constitutional scholars for its clarity, legal reasoning, and careful balance between competing constitutional principles. In her opinion, Justice Vasquez wrote, "The Constitution's promise of equal justice under law requires not only fair application of legal principles, but also recognition that those who interpret and apply the law must themselves embody the principles of equality and mutual respect that the Constitution enshrines." Legal scholars would later note that while the opinion did not directly reference the incident with Judge Caldwell, its emphasis on judicial ethics and professional respect reflected Justice Vasquez's belief that the integrity of the legal system depended as much on how judges treated each other as on how they interpreted the law. The incident also sparked broader conversations about diversity and representation within the federal judiciary. Law schools began incorporating discussions of judicial diversity into their constitutional law curricula, and bar associations created programs designed to support attorneys from underrepresented groups who aspired to judicial careers. Justice Vasquez would go on to serve with continued distinction on the Supreme Court, her intellectual contributions and judicial leadership earning recognition from across the political and legal spectrum. Her handling of the incident with Judge Caldwell became a model for how individuals in positions of authority could respond to discrimination and bias in ways that created positive institutional change. 5 years after the incident, Judge Caldwell would write in a law review article, "The most important lesson I learned that day was not about judicial procedure or constitutional law, but about the assumptions we all carry and how those assumptions can undermine the very principles we have sworn to uphold. Justice Vasquez taught me that true judicial excellence requires not just legal knowledge, but the humility to recognize and overcome our own biases." The Federal Judicial Center would eventually establish the Justice Vasquez Excellence in Judicial Education program, providing ongoing professional development for federal judges with emphasis on inclusive leadership, cultural competency, and ethical decision-making. The program became a model for judicial education systems around the world. Perhaps most significantly, the incident contributed to broader efforts to diversify the federal judiciary, with judicial nominating committees and bar associations working more actively to identify and support qualified candidates from all backgrounds. Justice Vasquez herself became a mentor to young attorneys and judges, particularly women and individuals, from communities that had been historically underrepresented in the federal judiciary. The marble corridors of the Robert H. Jackson Federal Building, where the incident had occurred, would later display a plaque commemorating the importance of judicial excellence, diversity, and mutual respect in the administration of justice. The plaque bore a quote from Justice Vasquez's landmark constitutional opinion: "Justice is best served when those who interpret the law reflect the full diversity of the nation they serve, bringing different perspectives and experiences to the sacred task of constitutional interpretation." For the legal profession as a whole, the incident served as a wake-up call about the need for continued vigilance against bias and discrimination, even within institutions that prided themselves on fairness and equality. Law firms, bar associations, and legal organizations implemented new policies and programs designed to create more inclusive professional environments. The story of Justice Vasquez and Judge Caldwell would be taught in law schools and judicial education programs for decades to come, serving as a powerful reminder that the pursuit of justice required not just intellectual excellence, but also the moral courage to confront bias and work toward a more perfect union where all qualified individuals could serve with dignity and respect. In the end, what began as an embarrassing confrontation between two federal judges became a catalyst for positive change throughout the American legal system, proving that even the most difficult moments could be transformed into opportunities for growth, learning, and progress toward the constitutional ideal of equal justice under law. And that's how one judge's assumptions about what Supreme Court justices should look like nearly created a constitutional crisis in America's federal court system. Sometimes the most important lessons about justice come not from legal textbooks, but from examining our own biases and preconceptions about who deserves to hold positions of authority. If this story made you think about the importance of judging people by their qualifications rather than their appearance, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories about constitutional principles, judicial excellence, and the ongoing struggle to create a more perfect union. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that challenges us to live up to our highest ideals of justice and equality. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.